firearms violence is mainly based in organised crime. So solving firearms violence is not about solving firearms. It's about solving the propensity to move to violence to resolve dispute for a population. And those are cultural issues.
Hey everyone, this is Gage Hallbrook from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation today, here to talk to you about Justin Trudeau's proposed gun buyback and some similar programs that we've seen around the world and how that would relate to Canadian firearms owners. So as almost everybody watching this knows, in May 2020, the federal government banned over 1,500 different types of firearms and said that they're going to be buying those back from firearms owners in a bid to increase public safety and reduce crime. In the last couple of years, other countries have done buybacks, and today Michael Dowling is joining me to discuss the experience in New Zealand. Thanks for coming on, Michael.
It's a pleasure.
So to kind of get things started, Michael, can you tell me a little bit about who you are and what your organization does?
Okay, I'm the chair of the Council of Licensed Firearm Owners in New Zealand. And we're a body formed in 1996 when the associations of shooting disciplines realised that we needed to get the skill set centralised and deconflict positions between different disciplines so that we lobbied in an effective way in regard to legislative and regulative changes.
Sounds good. And that's talking about gun policy, correct?
Correct. Specifically that policy and making sure we had the right skill sets and the right discussions happening. We still realise the different disciplines have specific issues that they need to represent and lobby on, but it was trying to deconflict common positions.
Right. So it's kind of fair to say, what you're talking about on guns here in Canada, you have to take 2 courses if you want to get to the full gun license and then apply to the government, get that back, and then you go to the store and you buy them. So what's the process like in New Zealand to own a gun? Is it similar to Canada? Is it different? How does that work?
So we, up to now, have had the individual licensed and haven't had full registration. I understand you guys stepped off full registration about a decade ago. That has been reintroduced for us, full registration. So up to now, you had to do a safety course, you had to pass the assessment and had to be deemed a fit and proper person to have access to firearms. That gets you a standard firearms license. If you wanted to have access to pistols or collector's items or semi-automatics to use for pest control, then there's higher levels of security requirements and higher levels of vetting.
Right. Okay. So that sounds fairly similar. You mentioned pest control. What is the type of things that a typical New Zealander uses their firearm for once they get that license?
Well, the usual reason someone owns a firearm is for hunting, whether it be to put food on the table or to reduce the number of pests on a property. Pest control it was identified when we had the buyback that there was reason to have semi-automatic centre-fire firearms. And so that reason was identified as to control mobs of pests. And so now there's a new endorsement for pest controllers to have access to those firearms and use them specifically for pest control.
Okay, that makes sense. So I'd say, yeah, it seems like there's a pretty similar gun culture between the two countries. Here, I would say most people, when they own a firearm, it's for hunting, that same type of thing. But let's kind of get back to the point of why I brought you on, your expertise. So back in 2019, we saw the New Zealand government implemented what's called a gun buyback program after a tragic mass shooting. Can you kind of go through what that program entailed and what the government said was going to happen and everything along with that?
For us, it was a catastrophic event for firearm owners as well as the nation. It was the first time we had experienced terrorism. So that had a massive impact on the population. The opinion of a lot of our members is basically police didn't waste the crisis and went in to government and blamed the lobby groups and firearm owners for the problems that occurred. Within 5 days, a deputy commissioner said, we did nothing wrong, we followed our processes correctly. And then everything got wrapped up in a Royal Commission of Inquiry to discover what happened. It was 18 months later that the truth was revealed, that the police had not followed the process that was in legislation and regulation and had issued a licence to someone who would not have qualified for a firearms licence. So that was the events around how it happened. It doesn't take away the fact that someone decided to take lives to make their point. And so the government of the day said, what we'll do is we will make changes, and then made it a competition to do it faster than Australia did, which they openly said. They made these changes and banned these firearms in 10 days. We're going to do it shorter. And they did. And to our frustration, we told them that it was a big mistake, that banning something rather than raising the vetting level or raising the security level would create unintended consequences. So there was some stats on what they collected. And the thing was, they went quite far-reaching, not as far-reaching as your government. I believe they even banned some coffee. Black Rifle Coffee Company 15 was banned when I saw the initial list from you guys. But they identified firearms that had a magazine capacity of more than 10 rounds as being prohibited. And that affected all sorts of firearms. So it affected historic firearms that had been made in the 1800s and had tubular magazines under the barrel, and pistol-type cartridges. So they were affected and then considered prohibited. It also affected a whole lot of .22 caliber rifles, 22 long rifle, that were used for hunting possums and rabbits. So when you look at it around what was collected, the police records say there was about 58,000 firearms handed in, but when you strip it back, they weren't all centre-fire military-style semi-automatics. And you have to go into the detail and find out of the military-style semi-automatics, which was a definition we had, there was only around 13,000 of them. And our concern was that the way they'd done this, where you start to legislate something as being banned after a time when it's never been regulated, then you run the risk of not getting everything back. And so we did some checking with some of the importers, and they were able to release what various importers had imported over 5 and 10 years. And we estimated that around 200,000 centre-fire semi-automatic firearms probably didn't get handed in. And so that now sits in the grey market, which is firearms that are held illegally but not for criminal intent. And our concern is that in the future they'll make their way into the black market.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack on that one. Fortunately, back in Canada, the coffee company is no longer on that list. We can still get our morning cups. So when it comes to the guns that were specifically banned, to narrow down on that, so you mentioned the 10-round magazine, but then it was also more of a sweeping ban, as I understand it, on semi-automatic centerfire firearms. Is that correct as well?
The comment from the Prime Minister at the time was that they wanted to focus on the firearms that the terrorist had used. So they were lever action, pump action, and AR-15 style semi-automatics. And that's what police focused on and worked hard. If there was anyone who had those style of firearms, they gave very little room for them to retain them. Having said that, when you go through and look at it, there were around 13,000 to 14,000 military-style semi-automatics. Only around 5,000 of those were destroyed because a number of people held them on their collector's license and continued to retain them on their collector's license.
Okay. So basically now, from on that, they collected 60,000 firearms in total. It's been about 2 years since the buyback. In your estimation, did it kind of accomplish what the government was setting out to do? Obviously, they wanted to reduce crime, try and make tragedies not happen. Was that the case?
So, and you have to unpick that a wee bit. What did government attempt to do? What they intended to do was make the populace feel at ease by doing something. So they did something. Um, did it make us safer? If you look at the crime stats that have occurred since the buyback, there have been more gang and organised crime related shootings. The general atmosphere with gangs as they've armed up, they were asked at the time, would you be handing in your firearms? And they openly said, no, we need them for self-protection. So they didn't participate. None of the illegal black market firearms got handed in. So we end up with a situation where it has been worse for armed violence.
So basically, to conclude, that you're saying is that in the years since the buyback, armed violence has actually went up, despite the government trying to collect all those firearms.
Yeah, and it was because it was largely ineffective. And we saw this previously. We had an event back in '92 where an unwell person used their firearms to shoot some police and innocent civilians. So that occurred, and they decided to invent this term called military-style semi-automatics, which was particular to New Zealand, and all your AR-15s were encompassed in that. So they passed this law where one had never existed before and made the restrictions a lot greater around ownership. You had to be vetted, you had to have higher level of security. Now, what we identified in that was we were aware in the years just prior to that change, the military had released about 3,500 military-style semi-automatics into the civilian market, and only half of them ended up being registered. So that gave us the indicator. If you change the law without creating the right incentives, then it doesn't achieve the outcome. And we gave them that warning. And obviously the incentives weren't right to enable people to make the transition. So they didn't.
Right, exactly. So by and large, this program from the government didn't do what they said, ended up increasing crime, despite experts saying to the contrary. When it looks up about it, do you know anything about the cost of the program, what it cost the government to do this ineffective buyback?
The figure from memory was around total paid for the buyback was about 104 million. And that was for buyback one. And then they had a second buyback when they came back and realised they made some errors in the legislation. So that occurred in 2021. And then the total at that point was 2.4 million as well. So all in all, cost them around 106 million to do the buyback. But that doesn't include the actual costs of doing the whole thing. And this is where it became a bit of a mess, because the whole thing was rushed and has created problems where they've had to go back and fix legislation as a result. The regulations are having to be more detailed. And even with the rush program, we've had a 4-year program of pushing through regulation. A lot of that has created unintended consequences, and we're having to go back and repair pieces of regulation that were just rushed and the wording was wrong.
Right, and I heard that administrative costs for the program from an Auditor General report over there, so that those had almost doubled, and that doesn't even include the cost of buying the guns, which you mentioned was about 106 million in total. Just to give some reference to everybody else, New Zealand is a much smaller country than we are. We got 39 million people, and how many about in New Zealand?
We've got just over 5 million people.
Just over 5 million. So when we look at those costs kind of translated to Canada, we kind of got to pump them up a bit. And, I think we're safe to say that our government will spare no dollar, as they do when it comes to these types of programs. So people are listening to make that a little bit more context specific, got a little more ground to cover. We talked about the costs and how it was a lot. We talked about how the crime had actually went up since this time in the buyback. Do you think there's anything else that would be important for people to know about the experience of the buyback in New Zealand, or anything you think I might have missed?
I guess the term we identified buyback irritated us quite a bit because we never bought them off the government in the first place. So a lot of the members called it confiscation. It was quite a tough time. And one of the things we did to support our people was we arranged club-based events to go through the process. And that meant you had the support of your colleagues and peers to go through the parting with something that may have a historic value to your family or be a prized possession. So that was something we did to support our people, is made sure that we were supporting each other as we went through it. One of the big impacts as you went through it was the way the media played the blame game and said it was the lobby groups and it was the firearm owners. And for quite a period, licensed firearm owners over here were demonised as just being like the terrorist. And that was a difficult time for a lot of our membership. And we are responsible people with firearms, so we're very slow to anger, but we're very slow to let go of it as well. And police are getting frustrated with the fact that we keep reminding them that they scapegoated us.
No, I think a lot of firearm owners in Canada are definitely feeling the same way. Same as in New Zealand, we have to take a test. We're responsible with our guns. They have to be locked up safely. Now the government's placing the blame on some illegal happenings on people who have been responsible for decades in some cases. So I think we share definitely some of those frustrations as well. But yeah, Michael, I appreciate you coming on. Thank you for doing this.
Not a problem. Appreciate the opportunity, and I hope it goes better for you guys than it did for us.
We're going to try our best, and we're going to bring up your example as often as possible to mention that these gun buybacks don't work. They're just they're not decreasing crime, and they're costing taxpayers money, and they're taking guns out of the hands of law-abiding firearms owners.